Be prepared, give thanks, and be patient. When we think about where we go from here, Colossians has some great advice. It says to be prepared. It says to give thanks and to be patient. And in some ways, this is what making Christ Lord of our lives looks like. It's being prepared. It's getting ready. It's recognizing that there is something next, and we have a choice how we think about that thing that is coming next. And it's developing this attitude of gratitude that I mentioned a second ago. And throughout it all, it's being patient with ourselves, being patient with one another, even being patient with God, because sometimes God's timing isn't our timing. And that can be really frustrating. But it's being patient. Colossians is one of those short New Testament epistles. It takes less than 15 minutes to sit down and read the whole thing, even if we read it thoughtfully and carefully. And if we spend time in this epistle, we find encouragement and advice for Christ followers who are living in a multicultural world. And that's us. We can distill from our reading this morning those helpful words about preparation, gratitude, and patience. And whether it's the end of the church year, as is today, or Thanksgiving dinner, or getting ready for Advent, being prepared can help us avoid getting caught off guard. Normally we know or have some sense of what's coming next. We might know if we're getting to the end of the semester, or in this case to Thanksgiving break, that there's going to be some travel this week. And when we know something's coming, we can sort of gear up for it or gird our loins. Does anybody say that? But you get the point. You can get ready for whatever's happening. If you're going to have family with you, or if you're going to go visit family, we can prepare ourselves for what we can anticipate. And that getting ready is really important for how we react to what we experience. And the same thing goes for developing this attitude of thanksgiving, of gratitude in our lives, where we look around actively for that which we can be grateful, and we count our blessings and name them one by one. And as we do, we start to remember there are more, and there are more, and there are more. And patience is always a good idea. No matter the situation, no matter what's happening, no matter who we're with, patience never hurts. It always helps. Colossians comes out of a particular place. The people of Colossae were looking for meaning. They were encouraging one another, and they were trying to do good in the world, and that's so much like us. They lived in this multicultural context, again, just like us. And even though we are separated from them by almost 2 millennia, we have a lot in common with the Colossians. During the first century in the Phrygian mountains, a trading route connected Ephesus, which we know from the book of Ephesians, that's our familiarity, but it's on the west coast of Turkey, or what was Asia Minor then, but we know today as Turkey. And about 110 miles from Ephesus, there was this river valley with 3 cities. Laodicea was pretty big at the time, and it was kind of the commercial hub, Laodicea. Another, Hierapolis, was famous for its medicinal hot springs. But the least of those 3 cities in that river valley was Colossae. It was known for its textile industry and purple wool products. But in all 3 cities, the people shared some things in common, and that was how dissimilar they were. There was a trading route. There were people coming through. There were people who heard about the hot springs, and so were going to head over and check them out. There were Phrygians. There were Greeks. There were even some Jewish people in Laodicea. There were almost 10,000 who had come several centuries earlier after the Babylonian exile. These were multicultural cities with people holding different beliefs and bringing different ideas together. And if that doesn't sound familiar, I encourage you to walk out these doors, go west along West Main Street and to Becomes University, and look around, because we are in a multicultural environment. We are in a place where people come from all over the world to see and to study and to enjoy the resources of this incredible university. And so as we have all these people coming together, we get to see different ideas. What we know as Colossians was probably written in the 80s by one of Paul's students. And even though scholars still debate exactly when someone wrote it and who that someone was, the point of the letter is to encourage Christ followers in their multicultural context. And there's some parts of this short epistle that might be hard for us today, especially the household instructions in chapter 3. But throughout the book, we can find practical advice, like the encouragement in our reading to get ready for whatever's happening, to develop this attitude of being thankful and intersperse it all with some patience. And we need that kind of encouragement today. Our reading includes a great hymn in verses 15 to 20. And we need the beauty and splendor of words like that, whether it's an anthem, whether it's a hymn, whether it's an old favorite, whether it's a new favorite. We need those words of what can be called a high Christology. They raise Jesus up on a high level. We need the practical guidance of how to follow something divine in a world that cries out, "Me first." Colossians gives us insight into what it means to follow Jesus. And that song of praise in verses 15 to 20 can be centering. It can invite us to get out of our heads and into a good place. Before our reading, it says the Colossian church, the Colossian Christ followers shared love and spirit. That was in verse 8. So just before our reading that Seth so clearly shared with us began in verse 11. In verse 8, it talks about how they shared this love in spirit. They were united. They worked together and faced the challenges they encountered as one body. And we can take from that the inspiration today to be that kind of united one church that is loving in spirit. And it provides a testimony about what we believe to the people who are in our orbit. When we live like that, when we live the way Jesus calls us to live, others get to see it and get to see this church is like that. Our reading begins with echoes of this epistle's overall theme. May you be made strong with all the strength that comes from Jesus' glorious power. One commentator writes about the book, Colossians is a rich and enigmatic book. It's enigmatic because the phrases can be dense. They can be dripping with theology, and sometimes they can be hard to unpack and apply to our lives today. Some of the text is a departure from Paul's other letters, specifically the household instructions that we find in chapter 3. But the whole thing lacks the urgency we find in the earlier letters like 1 Thessalonians and Galatians. But we don't need our entire New Testament to say the same thing, and we don't need it to all have the same tone. Here we find an invitation for days like this, when we celebrate who Jesus is to us. An invitation to look at him and reflect on him and appreciate Jesus as King of our lives, which, if we are Christ followers, we are actively proclaiming that he is the King of our lives. To answer the question, who is he? Our reading says he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Now, that is the start of this hymn in verse 15. And scholars have spent a lot of time and spilled a lot of ink trying to unpack those verses. They argue about whether it's a hymn or a poem. They dispute about how to divide it. Should it be 2 strophes, 3 strophes of 2 verses? There's all kinds of arguments. And each scholar who makes such a case tries to build a compelling argument around it. The author who wrote Colossians, did the same person write the hymn, or was the author quoting something they already knew? Well, I find that intellectual inquiry, I was going to say I find it fascinating, but as I'm hearing myself, I've been reading this all week, and it's less fascinating to me now that I've synthesized it and put it all together. So while I find it existent, it reminds me of something Juan Luis Segundo wrote in 1948. He was wrestling with the kind of philosophy that he was developing. He was putting it together, and he had just been digesting Husserl's phenomenology and Heidegger's existentialism. And he writes in this 1948 book, he was 23 years old at the time, "We can no longer carry the burden of a philosophy that leaves us alone at dinner time. We can no longer carry the burden of a philosophy that leaves us alone at dinner time." This was a warning to the kind of mental gymnastics that can wrap us around the axle. Segundo reminds us that our belief system can't abandon us at dinner time, to use his phrase, or during the ups and downs and twists and turns and all of the things of life. It's got to mean something. It's got to speak to who we are, and it has to be practical. In Colossians, we read words for daily life. We find instructions that we can apply to how we live, whether we're thinking about Christ as our King or how to have civil conversations around the Thanksgiving dinner table. It says, be strong and be prepared in the very first verse of our reading, verse 11. And then in verse 12, it encourages us to give thanks. There's a reminder of our eternal connection to God in verses 13 to 14. And even though books like Colossians can feel distant because there's no story like we have in the Gospels, the book, if we let it, and if we take the time to get into it, can bring an encouraging word for us today. Encouragement like be strong can sound vacuous and lacking in meaning if we divorce it from this, the family of faith. Colossians says, be strong in the same breath that it says, Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. And at the end of our reading, in verse 20, God is reconciling everything, all of creation, back to God's self. Nothing is outside of God's reach or God's love or potential for reconciliation. We are an inclusive family of faith. And Colossians is one of those places that gives us clear instructions that God is God and we're not. So we don't need to judge others. We don't need to build up a long list of rules. We don't really have the wall space to post one anyway. But we don't need to decide who's in and who's out, who can be included and who must be excluded. This is one of those places that is so explicit about God not only loving the world, but God loving all of creation. And so as we don't need to judge, we only need to focus on the things that we can do. And in our reading today, if we really chew on the words and distill it down into something that is practical for us to take with us as we walk out of this space, we can take with it to be prepared. Develop gratitude. And to intersperse patience into all of it. This is great advice for every single day, whether it's Christ the King Sunday, Thanksgiving around the table, or a random Tuesday. Today, however, is in fact Christ the King Sunday. which is a wonderful juxtaposition with what's next. See, today we raise Jesus high and think of him as King of the universe. And in the coming season, we're going to be celebrating his humble entry into the world. We'll say more about that in the weeks to come. But spoiler alert, being born in a barn to an unwed teenager is a pretty inauspicious way to start life. But as we prepare for where we're going next, I was thinking about this epistle and what it can say to us for today. No matter the day or time, being prepared and giving thanks and exercising some patience can help us reflect the light of Christ into our world. Even if we encounter people who see the world differently from us. So today, as you get ready to go from this place, do these things. I've said them a number of times, so I don't need to repeat them again. But when we do these things, we can show the world that Jesus is Lord of our lives. Amen.